Hello, welcome back to Insomnia History, where we explore the hidden stories of the past, perfect for winding down before bed. I'm so glad you're joining me tonight. Have you ever imagined that some of the greatest masterpieces in history were actually created in frustration, exhaustion, and even pain? Picture this. You're forced to take on a project you never wanted. Working high above the ground, your neck aching, your back screaming, sweat dripping down your face. Yet somehow, you create a work of art that leaves the world in awe for centuries. That's exactly the story of Michelangelo and the Sistine Chapel ceiling. It's a breathtaking masterpiece born out of struggle, pressure, and hidden secrets you probably never knew about. So what really happened when Michelangelo painted that ceiling? What mysteries lie hidden within his brushstrokes? And why has the Sistine Chapel become such an iconic symbol of Western art? Get cozy, relax, and let's journey back in time together. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below. In the heart of Renaissance Italy, as the year 1508 unfolded, a reluctant artist was about to create what would become one of humanity's most treasured masterpieces. Michelangelo Buonarroti, then 33 years old, wanted absolutely nothing to do with the Sistine Chapel's ceiling. This statement might seem shocking to us now, considering the reverence with which we view this monumental work. Yet, the truth remains that the man behind this incomparable achievement initially refused the commission. To understand Michelangelo's reluctance, we must first understand the man himself. By 1508, he had already established himself as the preeminent sculptor of his generation. His David and Pietà had stunned the artistic world, earning him fame throughout Italy and beyond. These works of marble, breathtaking in their emotional power and technical brilliance, had cemented his reputation as a sculptor without equal. His self-identity was firmly rooted in sculpture. Michelangelo considered himself primarily, even exclusively, a sculptor. His hands were meant to carve stone, not apply pigment to plaster. When he thought of his artistic legacy, he envisioned magnificent sculptures that would endure through the ages. Painting, especially on the scale proposed for the Sistine Chapel, was simply not part of his plan. At this pivotal moment in his career, Michelangelo was deeply engaged in what he considered his most important commission yet. Pope Julius II, known as the warrior pope for his ambitious military campaigns, had commissioned a monumental tomb for himself. This was no ordinary funerary monument, but a massive architectural and sculptural complex that would require 40 statues. For Michelangelo, the tomb represented the ultimate sculptural challenge. It would be a showcase for his talents, allowing him to create numerous figures in marble that would demonstrate his unsurpassed ability to bring stone to life. He threw himself into the project with characteristic intensity, traveling to Carrara to personally select the marble blocks needed for this grand undertaking. The relationship between Michelangelo and Pope Julius II was complex and often strained. Both men possessed formidable personalities and fierce determination. Julius, who had ascended to the papacy in 1503, was a powerful patron of the arts with grand visions for Rome's renewal. He was not a man accustomed to hearing the word no, especially from an artist, even one as acclaimed as Michelangelo. The dynamics of patronage in Renaissance Italy were intricate. Artists depended on wealthy patrons for their livelihood, and no patron was more prestigious than the Pope himself. Refusing a papal commission was not simply a matter of personal preference. It could have serious consequences for one's career and standing. Michelangelo, despite his fame, was not immune to these realities. When Julius approached Michelangelo about painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling, the artist found himself in a difficult position. The existing ceiling was a simple blue surface with golden stars. hardly befitting the importance of this sacred space. Julius envisioned something far more magnificent, and he had decided that Michelangelo was the man to create it. Michelangelo's objections were numerous and substantial. First and foremost, he considered himself a sculptor, not a painter. While he had some experience with painting, he had never worked with fresco, the demanding technique required for Sistine Chapel. Fresco painting involves applying pigment to wet plaster before it dries, requiring speed, precision, and a completely different set of skills than those used in sculpture. The artist's lack of experience with fresco was a genuine concern. The technique is unforgiving, allowing little room for error or revision. Once the plaster dries, the pigment becomes part of the wall itself. Mistakes cannot be easily corrected. For someone accustomed to the methodical process of sculpture, where adjustments could be made throughout the creative process, the immediacy of fresco represented a formidable challenge. Beyond his technical concerns, Michelangelo had emotional and artistic investments in the tomb project. He had already devoted significant time and energy to planning this monumental work. The concept for the tomb had taken shape in his mind, and he had begun the laborious process of selecting and quarrying marble. To abandon this project, even temporarily, was deeply frustrating. Michelangelo suspected, not without reason, that his rivals might be behind the Pope's insistence that he paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Chief among these perceived adversaries was the architect Donato Bramante, who was overseeing the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica. Some historical accounts suggest that Bramante, perhaps jealous of Michelangelo's favor with the Pope, encouraged Julius to assign him the ceiling project, hoping that the sculptor would fail at this unfamiliar art form. The political intrigue of the papal court added another layer of complexity to Michelangelo's situation. Renaissance Rome was a world of shifting alliances, whispered conspiracies, and artistic rivalries. Navigating these treacherous waters required not only artistic genius, but also political savvy. Michelangelo, while undoubtedly a genius, was not known for his diplomatic skills or patience with court politics. Some accounts suggest that the Pope's interest in the Sistine Chapel ceiling coincided with financial difficulties that threatened the tomb project. As funding for the massive tomb complex became uncertain, Julius may have seen the ceiling commission as a way to redirect Michelangelo's talents while he sorted out the financial aspects of the tomb. For Michelangelo, this represented a devastating setback to what he considered his most important work. In his attempts to avoid the ceiling commission, Michelangelo suggested alternative artists who he believed were better suited to the task. He reportedly recommended Raphael, another brilliant artist of the period who had more experience with fresco painting. Julius, however, was determined to have Michelangelo and would not be dissuaded by these suggestions. The negotiations between artist and patron continued for months, with Michelangelo becoming increasingly frustrated and Julius growing more insistent. The artist even fled Rome briefly, returning to Florence to escape the pressure. This dramatic gesture illustrates the depth of his resistance to the project that would eventually become his most famous work. What finally convinced Michelangelo to accept the commission remains somewhat unclear. Some historians suggest that he ultimately realized the futility of refusing a papal command. Others propose that financial considerations played a role, as the ceiling project offered a substantial commission at a time when the tomb project was in financial limbo. Perhaps most compelling is the theory that Michelangelo's own artistic ambition eventually overcame his resistance. Despite his initial reluctance, once Michelangelo committed to the Sistine Chapel project, he approached it with characteristic thoroughness. He began by studying the architecture of the chapel itself, considering how his design would interact with the existing space. The chapel's dimensions presented their own challenges. At approximately 40 meters long, 13 meters wide, and 20 meters high, the ceiling offered an enormous canvas, but one that was far above the viewers' heads. Michelangelo's preparations included creating numerous drawings and studies. Though many of these preliminary works have been lost to time, those that survive reveal his meticulous planning process. He worked out compositional problems on paper before ever touching the ceiling itself, resolving issues of perspective and arrangement that would be difficult to address once the actual painting began. The subject matter for the ceiling was initially proposed to be the 12 apostles. However, Michelangelo convinced the Pope to allow him to pursue a far more ambitious program. The expanded scheme would include scenes from Genesis, prophets, Sibyls, and the ancestors of Christ. This comprehensive theological vision would transform the ceiling from a mere decorative element into one of the most profound artistic statements in Western culture. Before Michelangelo could begin painting, he needed to assemble a team of assistants and develop a working method. Though he is often portrayed as a solitary genius, the scale of the Sistine Chapel project made collaboration necessary. He recruited several assistants from Florence, including painters who had experience with fresco technique. These individuals would help prepare the plaster, mix pigments, and assist with the enormous logistical challenges of the project. The physical preparations for the work were themselves monumental. Scaffolding had to be constructed that would allow access to the ceiling without impeding the chapel's continued use for religious services. Michelangelo designed a unique scaffolding system that was attached to the walls with brackets, creating a platform approximately 60 feet above the chapel floor. This ingenious solution allowed the chapel to remain functional during the years of painting. Materials for the project had to be carefully selected and prepared. The lime for the plaster needed to be of the highest quality, aged properly to ensure it would accept the pigments correctly. Pigments themselves were expensive and often difficult to obtain. Particularly valuable were ultramarine blue, made from ground lapis lazuli, and vermilion red, both of which would feature prominently in the completed ceiling. As Michelangelo finally began work on the ceiling in 1508, he faced a steep learning curve. His first attempts at fresco painting revealed his inexperience with the medium. The initial sections of the ceiling show evidence of his adaptation to the technique, with visible corrections and adjustments as he gained proficiency. What's remarkable is how quickly he mastered this new art form, soon painting with a confidence that belied his previous lack of experience. The physical demands of the project were extreme. Contrary to popular belief, Michelangelo did not lie on his back to paint, but instead worked standing up on the scaffolding, his neck craned backward as he painted the surface above him. This uncomfortable position, maintained for hours each day, took a tremendous toll on his body. In letters and poems from this period, he vividly described the physical discomfort caused by this unnatural posture. One particularly revealing document is a poem Michelangelo wrote to his friend Giovanni da Pistoia in 1509, about a year into the project. In this verse, he describes how his body has been deformed by the work, with his beard pointing toward heaven, his neck permanently bent, and his skin hanging loose from his frame. While clearly exaggerated for poetic effect, these descriptions convey the genuine physical hardship involved in creating the ceiling. The mental challenges were equally daunting. Michelangelo was creating an integrated composition of unprecedented complexity, with multiple narrative scenes and figure groups that needed to work together visually and conceptually. The intellectual and creative energy required to sustain this vision over 4 years was enormous, particularly for an artist who still considered himself primarily a sculptor forced into an unwanted painting commission. As work progressed, Michelangelo's approach evolved. The first sections he completed, chronologically the last in the biblical narrative, depicting the drunkenness of Noah, show smaller figures and more crowded compositions. As he gained confidence and refined his vision, the figures became larger and more powerful, culminating in the iconic creation of Adam at the center of the ceiling. The relationship between Michelangelo and Pope Julius remained complicated throughout the project. The Pope was impatient for results and frequently asked when the work would be completed. Famously, when Julius demanded to know when the ceiling would be finished, Michelangelo reportedly replied, "When I can." This terse response exemplifies the tension between the two strong-willed men, as well as Michelangelo's determination to complete the work properly, regardless of papal pressure. Julius would occasionally climb the scaffolding to inspect the work in progress, an unusual action for a pope and an indication of his personal investment in the project. These visits added to Michelangelo's stress, as the artist preferred to work without scrutiny until sections were completed to his satisfaction. The Pope's frequent inquiries about completion dates only intensified the pressure on the already strained artist. Despite the difficulties, work continued steadily from 1508 to 1512. During this period, Michelangelo transformed from a reluctant painter into a master of the fresco technique. The evolution of his style can be traced across the ceiling, from the relatively conventional early sections to the bold, powerful figures of the central panels. What began as an unwanted diversion from his sculptural work became the defining achievement of his early career. The irony of Michelangelo's initial resistance to the Sistine Chapel commission is not lost on art historians. The work he so desperately tried to avoid became not only his most famous creation, but also one of the most celebrated artistic achievements in human history. The ceiling stands as a testament to his genius, despite, or perhaps because of the challenges he faced in creating it. Even after completing the Sistine Chapel ceiling in 1512, Michelangelo's relationship with the Julius Tomb project continued to haunt him. Over the next several decades, he would return intermittently to this monumental sculptural commission, which was repeatedly scaled back from its original grand design. The tomb, which Michelangelo had once envisioned as his masterpiece, was ultimately completed in a much reduced form in San Pietro in Vincoli Church in Rome. The story of Michelangelo and the Sistine Chapel ceiling reminds us that greatness sometimes emerges from the most unlikely circumstances. A reluctant artist working in an unfamiliar medium created a masterpiece that continues to inspire awe more than 5 centuries later. Perhaps there is a lesson here about the unpredictable paths that lead to immortal achievement, and how our greatest contributions may come from the tasks we initially resist most strongly. The image is powerful and enduring. Michelangelo lying flat on his back atop wooden scaffolding, paint dripping onto his face as he creates his masterpiece stroke by stroke. It has been immortalized in film, literature, and popular imagination. This romantic vision of the tortured artistic genius, working in physical discomfort to produce transcendent beauty, appeals to our collective understanding of great art requiring great sacrifice. There's just one problem with this compelling image. It isn't true. Contrary to what millions believe, Michelangelo did not paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling while lying on his back. The reality of how he accomplished this monumental task is both more practical and, in some ways, more impressive than the popular myth suggests. In truth, Michelangelo and his assistants painted while standing upright on wooden scaffolds, reaching above their heads to apply pigment to the wet plaster of the ceiling. This position, while certainly uncomfortable and physically taxing, allowed for greater control and perspective than lying flat would have provided. The scaffolding itself represents an ingenious solution to a complex architectural problem. When confronted with the challenge of accessing the vast ceiling surface, Michelangelo didn't simply accept standard scaffolding techniques. Drawing on his architectural knowledge, he designed a unique system specifically for this project. His scaffolding consisted of wooden platforms supported by brackets inserted into holes in the chapel walls near the windows. This design was revolutionary for several reasons. Traditional scaffolding of the Renaissance period typically rested on the floor and rose upward in a tower-like structure. Such an arrangement would have made the chapel unusable during the years of painting, something Pope Julius II would not have permitted. The chapel needed to remain functional for important liturgical ceremonies throughout the painting process. Michelangelo's bracket-supported platforms, hovering approximately 60 feet above the chapel floor, left the space below largely unobstructed. Religious services could continue while work progressed overhead. This practical innovation reflected not just artistic genius, but architectural pragmatism. The artist under his commission existed within a living, functioning religious space. The scaffolding system covered only half the chapel ceiling at a time. As sections were completed, the entire structure was dismantled and reassembled to cover the remaining areas. This sequential approach allowed Michelangelo to refine his technique and vision as the work progressed. The earliest sections painted show his initial adaptation to fresco technique, while later sections display his growing mastery. Each day began with the preparation of fresh plaster for the section to be painted. This layer, known as intonaco, was applied carefully over the rough orecchio plaster that had been laid previously. The size of each day's section, called a giornata, Italian for a day's work, was determined by how much could reasonably be completed before the plaster dried. Once dry, the plaster would no longer accept pigment properly. Timing was crucial. In fresco painting, the intonaco remained workable for only about 6-10 hours, depending on temperature and humidity conditions. Within this window, Michelangelo had to apply all the pigments for that section. This created enormous pressure to work quickly but precisely, with no room for major revisions once the plaster began to set. Before applying each day's fresh plaster, Michelangelo transferred the outlines of his design to the wall using a technique called pouncing. This involved pricking holes along the lines of a full-scale drawing cartoon, and then dusting charcoal through these perforations to leave a dotted outline on the wall's surface. These faint guidelines helped him maintain compositional accuracy when painting the actual figures. The physical position required for this work was extraordinarily demanding. Standing on the platform, Michelangelo had to crane his neck backward while reaching up with his brush. Hour after hour, day after day, year after year, he maintained this unnatural posture. The toll on his body was severe and cumulative. Blood circulation to his brain was compromised by the constant upward tilting of his head. Muscle strain in his neck, shoulders, and arms became chronic. His eyes burned from paint droplets and plaster dust falling onto his face. These were not romantic inconveniences, but genuine physical hardships that threatened both his health and the progress of the work. The artist's own writings provide vivid testimony to these difficulties. In his correspondence and poetry from this period, Michelangelo described his physical suffering in graphic, sometimes humorous terms. He wrote of developing a permanent crick in his neck that made it impossible to read letters unless he held them above his head. He complained that his beard pointed skyward from the constant position of his face. In one particularly evocative poem to his friend Giovanni da Pistoia, written about a year into the project, Michelangelo lamented, "My stomach squashed under my chin." He described how his brush, above my face continually, makes a rich pavement with my droppings. These vivid descriptions help us understand the very real physical challenges involved in creating what appears from below as effortless beauty. Despite these hardships, Michelangelo's technique required extraordinary precision. Fresco painting allowed no room for major corrections. The pigments, ground minerals mixed with water, bonded chemically with the lime in the wet plaster as it dried. Once this reaction occurred, the image became essentially permanent, integrated into the wall itself rather than sitting on its surface. This permanence explains the remarkable preservation of the ceiling paintings over 5 centuries. Unlike oil paintings on canvas or wood, which can deteriorate through flaking or separation from their support, properly executed frescoes become part of the architectural structure. Michelangelo's understanding of this chemical process informed his technical approach to the project. The actual application of pigment required specialized brushes and a carefully developed technique. Because the plaster surface was wet, the paint behaved differently than on dry surfaces. Brush strokes needed to be confident and decisive. Michelangelo developed a distinctive hatching technique for modeling forms, using short, parallel strokes that created a sense of sculptural volume. This approach reveals how Michelangelo's sculptural background influenced his painting style. Even working in 2 dimensions, he conceived of figures in volumetric terms. The powerful musculature and 3-dimensional presence of his ceiling figures reflect his primary identity as a sculptor. He was, in essence, carving with light and shadow rather than with chisels. The palette available to fresco painters was limited by chemical compatibility with the lime plaster. Many pigments that worked well in oil or tempera painting would fade, darken, or chemically react when applied to wet plaster. Michelangelo worked within these constraints, achieving remarkable chromatic richness despite the technical limitations of the medium. His color choices were bold and symbolic. Brilliant blues made from expensive lapis lazuli were used for important draperies and backgrounds. Earth tones derived from various minerals and clays provided a warm foundation for flesh tones. Vibrant reds and oranges created dramatic accents throughout the composition. The overall effect was one of luminous color that seemed to radiate from the ceiling itself. The daily work routine on the Sistine ceiling followed a consistent pattern dictated by the requirements of fresco technique. Early morning hours were devoted to preparing the day's plaster and transferring design outlines. The middle of the day, with its optimal natural light, was reserved for the actual painting. As evening approached, preparations would begin for the next day's section. This routine continued with few interruptions from 1508 to 1512. During these 4 years, Michelangelo maintained an extraordinary level of focus and productivity. The ceiling represents approximately 5,000 square feet of painted surface, containing over 300 figures. The sheer scale of this achievement becomes even more impressive when we consider the difficult working conditions. The scaffolding itself added to these difficulties. The wooden platforms, while ingeniously designed, were not perfectly stable. They swayed slightly with movement, requiring the painter to maintain balance while executing precise brushwork. The height above the floor created an ever-present risk of serious injury from falls. Working in these conditions required not just artistic skill, but physical courage. Lighting presented another significant challenge. The chapel's windows provided inconsistent natural illumination that changed throughout the day and with weather conditions. Artificial light from oil lamps or candles was limited and created smoke that could damage the fresh paint. Michelangelo had to develop an acute sensitivity to how colors would appear under varied lighting conditions. During the winter months, cold temperatures in the unheated chapel slowed the drying time of the plaster, allowing slightly longer working periods, but making the environment even more uncomfortable. In summer, the heat accelerated drying, creating additional time pressure. These seasonal variations required constant technical adjustments to maintain consistent quality. Given these challenging conditions, it's reasonable to ask, if Michelangelo wasn't lying down to paint, where did this persistent misconception originate? The answer lies primarily in popular culture, specifically in the influential 1965 film, The Agony and the Ecstasy. based on Irving Stone's biographical novel of the same name. The film starred Charlton Heston as Michelangelo Due. In several memorable scenes, Heston's Michelangelo is shown painting while lying flat on his back on the scaffolding. These dramatic images, widely seen by international audiences, cemented the inaccurate idea in public consciousness. The film's artistic license transformed a physically demanding standing position into an even more visually compelling prone position. The misconception was further reinforced by the film's cultural impact. The agony and the ecstasy introduced many people to Michelangelo's achievement, becoming their primary reference point for understanding how the ceiling was created. As with many historical films, its dramatic visualizations proved more memorable than subsequent historical corrections. Art historians have consistently worked to correct this misunderstanding, pointing to contemporaneous accounts and Michelangelo's own writings as evidence of his actual working method. The artist's letters and poems clearly describe standing and looking up, not lying down. No primary historical source describes him painting on his back. Careful examination of the ceiling itself provides additional evidence for the standing position. The compositional structure, perspective, and proportions of the figures make most sense when conceived by an artist looking upward at an angle, not directly overhead. The foreshortening and dimensional relationships reflect this angular viewpoint. The practical logistics of fresco painting also argue against the lying down position. Applying pigment to wet plaster requires control that would be difficult to achieve while lying on one's back. The consistency of the paint and the pressure needed for proper application favor a standing position, despite its physical discomfort. Furthermore, Michelangelo needed to regularly step back to view his work from different angles and distances. A prone position would have made this essential aspect of the painting process cumbersome or impossible. The ability to shift perspective while working was crucial to maintaining compositional harmony across the vast ceiling surface. Contemporaneous accounts from visitors to the chapel during the painting process also support the standing position narrative. While access to the scaffolding was limited, those who did observe Michelangelo at work described him standing. No period documents mention him lying down to paint, despite the novelty such an approach would have represented. The physical evidence of the ceiling itself reveals Michelangelo's working process. Close examination shows the divisions between giorni, the sections completed in a single day. These divisions follow logical patterns consistent with an artist working while standing and moving along the scaffolding. The size and shape of these sections reflect what could reasonably be accomplished from a standing position. Understanding the actual working methods Michelangelo employed enhances rather than diminishes our appreciation of his achievement. Standing for hours with arms raised and neck bent backward represents a feat of physical endurance that equals the artistic accomplishment. The precision achieved under these difficult conditions makes the ceiling even more remarkable. Michelangelo's innovative scaffolding design also deserves recognition as an engineering achievement in its own right. His solution to the practical problem of accessing the ceiling while leaving the chapel functional demonstrates the integration of artistic and technical knowledge that characterized Renaissance genius. This holistic approach to creative challenges exemplified the period's ideal of the universal man. The reality of how Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel reminds us that great art emerges from a combination of inspiration and methodology. Behind the transcendent beauty of the ceiling lies a foundation of practical problem-solving and physical labor. The sublime and the technical were inseparable aspects of Michelangelo's creative process. While the romantic image of the artist lying on his back may persist in popular imagination, the historical truth offers its own compelling narrative. The story of Michelangelo standing on his self-designed scaffolding, reaching upward day after day despite growing physical discomfort, speaks to the extraordinary commitment behind this masterpiece. Sometimes, historical reality proves more impressive than the myths we create around it. The physical demands of painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling were extraordinary, as we've seen. But what was the psychological toll of this monumental undertaking? To understand the full human dimension of Michelangelo's achievement, we must examine not just the technical and artistic challenges, but also the deeply personal experience of the artist himself. Fortunately, Michelangelo left us a remarkable window into his inner state during this period through his writings, particularly his poetry. In 1599, as the work on the ceiling entered its second year, Michelangelo's discomfort and frustration reached a peak. The initial novelty of the project had worn off, replaced by the grinding reality of daily physical strain. The end remained distant, with vast sections of the ceiling still awaiting his brush. It was in this state of mind that he penned one of the most revealing documents we have about the creation of the Sistine Chapel ceiling. In a sonnet addressed to his friend Giovanni da Pistoia, Michelangelo described his suffering in vivid, sometimes humorous terms. This poem, while employing hyperbole for comic effect, nonetheless communicates genuine physical and emotional distress. "I've already grown a goiter from this torture," he wrote, referring to the strained position of his neck as he worked with his head tilted back for hours each day. The medical condition he jokingly references, a goiter or swelling in the neck, was not merely a poetic invention. The constant extension of his neck could indeed have caused inflammation and swelling of the thyroid gland. While probably not a literal goiter, the discomfort in his neck and throat was real enough to merit this colorful description. Michelangelo continues his litany of complaints with anatomical precision. "My stomach squashed under my chin." This graphic image captures how his posture, bent backward with neck extended, compressed his torso and internal organs. The physical contortion required for the work literally reshaped his body during the long hours on the scaffolding. Perhaps most vividly, he describes how "my face makes a fine floor for droppings." This refers to the constant rain of paint droplets and plaster dust that fell onto his upturned face. These materials weren't merely annoying. They contained caustic lime and pigments that could irritate the skin and eyes. Day after day, Michelangelo endured this shower of debris, adding chemical irritation to his physical discomfort. The poem continues with more bodily complaints. "My skin hangs loose below me, and my spine's all knotted from folding myself over." These descriptions suggest the physical deterioration he felt was happening to his body. The loose skin likely refers to how his bent posture caused his flesh to hang differently, while the knotted spine vividly captures the muscular tension and potential misalignment caused by months in an unnatural position. Despite the humorous tone, these physical complaints reveal something profound about the artistic process behind the Sistine ceiling. Creation of this magnitude required not just genius and skill, but physical endurance bordering on martyrdom. Michelangelo was literally reshaping his own body in service to his art, sacrificing physical comfort and potentially long-term health to realize his vision. The final line of the poem delivers its most telling revelation. "I am not in the right place. I am not a painter." Even well into the project, after demonstrating extraordinary skill with fresco technique, Michelangelo still identified primarily as a sculptor. This persistent self-image as a sculptor, forced into painting, reveals the psychological tension underlying the entire Sistine Chapel project. The poem to Giovanni da Pistoia is valuable not just for what it tells us about Michelangelo's physical discomfort, but for what it reveals about his state of mind. Behind the complaints and humor lies evidence of genuine distress. The project had become a kind of beautiful torture, an ordeal to be endured rather than a commission to be celebrated. This mental anguish stemmed from multiple sources. First was the physical pain itself, which was constant and cumulative. The daily discomfort of the working position, without adequate time for recovery, created chronic pain that affected every aspect of Michelangelo's life during these years. Pain of this nature doesn't remain merely physical, but infiltrates mood, outlook, and creative energy. Second was Michelangelo's frustration at being diverted from sculpture, which he considered his true vocation. Throughout the ceiling project, the unfinished tomb of Pope Julius II remained a painful reminder of his interrupted sculptural ambitions. What might he have accomplished in marble during these years? This question likely haunted him as he applied pigment to plaster day after day. Third was the enormous pressure of the commission itself. The Sistine Chapel was no ordinary space, but one of the most important religious sites in Christendom. Michelangelo was acutely aware that his work would be scrutinized by the most discerning eyes in Europe, including rival artists who might take pleasure in his failure. The weight of these expectations added psychological burden to the already demanding physical labor. Fourth was the inherent stress of working with fresco technique. The time-sensitive nature of the medium, requiring completion of each section before the plaster dried, created daily pressure that never abated. Unlike sculpture, where one could step away and return later, fresco painting imposed its own relentless schedule. This temporal constraint added urgency to already difficult working conditions. Finally, there was the sheer scale of the project and the seeming endlessness of the task. As months stretched into years, the physical and mental strain became increasingly difficult to bear. The ceiling measures approximately 40 meters long by 13 meters wide, over 5,000 square feet of surface area. Covering this vast expanse with complex interconnected scenes required sustained focus that tested the limits of human endurance. Despite these hardships, the poem also reveals Michelangelo's resilience and even his capacity for humor in adversity. The exaggerated descriptions and self-deprecating tone suggest a man who, despite genuine suffering, maintained enough psychological distance to transform his discomfort into art. The very act of writing the poem represents a kind of coping mechanism, using creative expression to process difficult experience. The sonnets and letters Michelangelo wrote during this period provide essential context for understanding the ceiling as a human achievement rather than simply an artistic one. They remind us that behind every brushstroke was a flesh and blood individual experiencing pain, doubt, frustration, and occasionally satisfaction. The ceiling was painted not by an abstract genius, but by a specific human being working under specific difficult conditions. Michelangelo's written complaints about the ceiling project extended beyond this single poem. In various letters to family members and associates during this period, he continued to express his discomfort and frustration. To his father in Florence, he wrote of exhaustion and physical ailments. To his brother, he complained of delayed payments from the papal treasury, adding financial worry to his physical distress. These personal communications reveal a man struggling on multiple fronts while creating what would become one of history's most celebrated artworks. The contrast between the transcendent beauty of the ceiling and the earthly suffering of its creator adds a poignant dimension to our appreciation of the work. Behind the divine figures floating effortlessly above lies the very human struggle of their creator. The physical symptoms Michelangelo described were not mere poetic inventions. Medical experts who have studied his writings suggest he likely suffered from several occupation-related conditions. These may have included cervical spine damage from the constant extension of his neck, arthritis in his shoulders and arms from working above his head, and even early cataract formation from the combination of looking upward into bright light and exposure to paint droplets. Contemporary accounts from those who knew Michelangelo during this period confirm his deteriorating physical condition. His appearance changed noticeably, with associates commenting on his haggard look and apparent aging beyond his years. Even his gait was affected, as the habitual posture required for painting began to influence how he carried himself even when away from the chapel. Sleep disturbances likely compounded his suffering. The physical pain, combined with the mental burden of the project, probably made restful sleep difficult to achieve. Chronic pain and sleep deprivation form a vicious cycle, each worsening the other. In this state of physical depletion, Michelangelo, nonetheless, continued to produce work of extraordinary quality and consistency. His diet during this period was reportedly poor, consisting mainly of bread and wine consumed while working. This inadequate nutrition would have further compromised his physical resilience and possibly contributed to the symptoms he described. Renaissance understanding of the relationship between diet and health was limited, and the concept of proper nutrition for sustained physical labor was not well developed. Psychological stress may have manifested in physical symptoms as well. What modern medicine recognizes as psychosomatic disorders, physical ailments triggered or worsened by mental states, would have been understood very differently in Michelangelo's time. The humoral theory of medicine prevalent in the Renaissance attributed such symptoms to imbalances in bodily fluids rather than psychological causes. The isolation inherent in the work likely contributed to Michelangelo's distress. While he had assistance for preparing materials and basic background elements, the actual painting of significant figures was done entirely by his hand. Hours of focused concentration, physically separated from others on the high scaffolding, created a kind of solitary confinement, broken only by occasional interactions with workers or visitors. This isolation suited Michelangelo's temperament in some ways. Contemporary accounts describe him as often solitary by nature, preferring the company of his work to that of other people. Yet, for someone inclined towards solitude, the extreme isolation of the ceiling project, combined with its physical demands, would have taxed his psychological resources. Pope Julius II's frequent inquiries about completion dates added another layer of stress. The Pope was not known for his patience, and his relationship with Michelangelo was often contentious. Julius would reportedly stand below the scaffolding, looking up and asking when the work would be finished. Michelangelo's famous reply, "When it is done," reveals the tension between artist and patron. These interactions with Julius were part of a complex power dynamic that shaped the entire project. Despite Michelangelo's stature as a renowned artist, he remained dependent on papal patronage and subject to papal authority. This dependency created an inherent tension that manifested in their sometimes confrontational exchanges about the progress of the work. Religious considerations added another dimension to Michelangelo's experience. As a devoutly religious man, he may have viewed his suffering as a form of spiritual discipline or sacrifice. The subject matter of the ceiling, biblical scenes depicting humanity's relationship with God, would have resonated with his own spiritual struggles. His physical ordeal became, in a sense, a lived counterpart to the sacred narratives he was depicting. The personal cost of creating the Sistine ceiling raises broader questions about the relationship between suffering and artistic achievement. Throughout history, we find numerous examples of great works created under conditions of physical hardship, psychological distress, or material deprivation. Does significant art require such sacrifice? Would Michelangelo's ceiling be what it is if created under more comfortable conditions? These questions have no definitive answers, but Michelangelo's case suggests that the relationship between suffering and creation is not simple. The physical hardships he endured clearly influenced the work, perhaps lending urgency and intensity to his expression. Yet, they also limited him in other ways, causing pain that diverted energy from creative tasks and potentially shortening the productive years of his career. What remains remarkable is how Michelangelo transformed his suffering into creative fuel, rather than allowing it to defeat him. The discomfort he so vividly described in his poem to Giovanni da Pistoia could have justified abandoning the project. Instead, he channeled his frustration into the work itself, perhaps finding in artistic creation a counterbalance to physical pain. This transformative capacity to convert personal hardship into artistic expression characterizes many of history's most significant creative figures. In Michelangelo's case, the physical ordeal of the Sistine ceiling became integrated into his artistic identity and working method. The suffering was not incidental to the creation, but became part of the creative process itself. As the project progressed, Michelangelo's technique evolved, suggesting a growing accommodation to the difficult working conditions. His brushwork became more efficient, his compositional approach more confident. The figures in later sections of the ceiling show greater boldness and economy of execution, indicating an artist who had mastered not just the fresco technique, but also the challenging circumstances of its application. By the third year of work on the ceiling, Michelangelo had developed a kind of physical adaptation to the demands of the project. While still uncomfortable, his body had formed new patterns of movement and posture that allowed him to work more efficiently in the difficult position. This physical adaptation paralleled his technical mastery of the fresco medium, both developing through sustained practice under pressure. The poem to Giovanni da Pistoia, with its vivid descriptions of physical distortion, captures a moment before this adaptation was complete. It represents a crisis point in the project, when the accumulated strain threatened to overwhelm even Michelangelo's formidable will. That he continued despite this distress speaks to his extraordinary determination and commitment to the work. When the Sistine ceiling was finally unveiled in its completed state on October 31st, 1512, the physical toll on its creator was evident to observers. Contemporaries noted Michelangelo's altered appearance and movement, the visible traces of 4 years of unprecedented labor. The artist himself reportedly said that after finishing the ceiling, he could only read letters by holding them above his head, as his neck had become permanently fixed in an upward position. This physical aftermath of the ceiling project affected Michelangelo for years afterward. Some medical historians suggest that chronic conditions developed during this period plagued him for the remainder of his long life. If so, the Sistine ceiling exacted a price far beyond the 4 years of its creation, influencing his health and comfort for decades to come. The sonnet to Giovanni da Pistoia thus stands as a crucial historical document, one that humanizes an artistic achievement often discussed in terms that verge on the superhuman. It reminds us that the Sistine Chapel ceiling, for all its transcendent beauty and theological profundity, was created through the daily labor of a human body, subject to pain, fatigue, and the limitations of flesh. When Michelangelo completed the Sistine Chapel ceiling in 1512, few could have predicted that his masterpiece would endure with such remarkable integrity for over 5 centuries. Yet, despite wars, pollution, natural disasters, and the simple passage of time, the frescoes have demonstrated an extraordinary resilience that speaks to both Michelangelo's technical mastery and the inherent durability of well-executed fresco paint. The remarkable preservation of the ceiling is no accident, but rather the result of the fresco technique itself. Unlike paintings on canvas or wood panel, which sit on the surface of their support, true fresco involves the integration of pigment with wet plaster through a chemical process. As the plaster dries, the pigments become chemically bonded with the calcium carbonate of the plaster, essentially becoming part of the wall itself, rather than merely adhering to its surface. This chemical integration creates a uniquely durable form of painting. The colors are not vulnerable to flaking or separation from their support, as can happen with oil or tempera paintings. Instead, the image exists within the wall structure, protected by the crystalline matrix of the dried plaster. For deterioration to occur, the plaster itself must be damaged or degraded. Michelangelo's technical execution of the fresco method was exemplary, contributing significantly to the ceiling's longevity. His meticulous preparation of the wall surface included multiple layers of specially formulated plaster. The bottom layer, known as the oricio, provided a rough, stable foundation. Over this, he applied the final intonaco layer, the smooth surface that received the pigments and incorporated them as it dried. The quality of materials used was equally important to the ceiling's durability. The line for the plaster was carefully selected and aged, ensuring optimal chemical properties. Pigments were chosen not just for their visual qualities, but for their compatibility with the fresco technique. Michelangelo avoided colors that were known to be unstable in alkaline environments, or that might react poorly with the lime in the plaster. These technical considerations may seem mundane compared to the artistic brilliance of the images, but they have proven crucial to the ceiling's survival. The marriage of artistic vision with technical expertise exemplifies the Renaissance ideal of the artist as both creative genius and master craftsman. Michelangelo's understanding of materials science, though not conceptualized in modern terms, was sophisticated and thorough. The environmental conditions of the Sistine Chapel have also contributed to the preservation of the ceiling. The chapel is a relatively stable microclimate, protected from the most extreme temperature fluctuations and direct exposure to sunlight. The high walls place the ceiling far from human touch, protecting it from the kind of direct physical damage that threatens many artworks. Yet, despite these advantages, the ceiling has not remained entirely untouched by time and circumstance. One notable casualty is a section of the panel depicting Noah's escape from the great biblical flood. A portion of the sky in this scene is now missing, lost to an incident that occurred nearly 3 centuries after the ceiling's completion. In 1797, an explosion at a nearby gunpowder depot sent shockwaves through Vatican City. The force was sufficient to dislodge a section of plaster from the Sistine ceiling, which fell to the floor and shattered. This missing piece represents the most significant physical damage the ceiling has sustained in its long history. The lost fragment was never replaced, leaving a visible reminder of the ceiling's vulnerability despite its overall resilience. This incident illustrates an important truth about the preservation of cultural heritage. Even the most durable artworks remain susceptible to catastrophic events. The explosion that damaged the Noah panel was an exceptional occurrence, but it demonstrates that no work of art, however well made, is immune to all threats. The survival of the remainder of the ceiling through this event speaks to its structural integrity. Over the centuries, the Sistine ceiling has faced more gradual threats as well. The accumulation of soot and grime presented a significant conservation challenge. Before the modern era, the chapel was illuminated by candles and oil lamps, which produced smoke that gradually deposited a layer of dark residue on the painted surface. This accumulation, combined with dust and airborne pollutants, progressively obscured Michelangelo's original colors. The application of various protective coatings and fixatives by well-meaning conservators also affected the appearance of the ceiling. These interventions, while intended to preserve the paintings, sometimes introduced new problems. Animal glues and other substances applied in previous centuries darkened over time, further altering the visual impression of the work. The most significant conservation challenge came from an unexpected source: moisture within the chapel itself. The presence of large congregations during religious ceremonies introduced substantial humidity into the environment. This moisture could penetrate the porous plaster, potentially carrying dissolved minerals that would recrystallize at the surface as the water evaporated, a process known as efflorescence. Despite these challenges, the overall structural integrity of the ceiling remained remarkably sound. The plaster adhered well to its support, with minimal detachment or flaking. The chemical bond between pigment and plaster remained stable in most areas. These fundamental aspects of preservation allowed for the possibility of restoration when conservation science reached a level of sophistication adequate to the task. That opportunity came in the late 20th century, when the Vatican authorized a comprehensive cleaning and restoration project that would ultimately span from 1980 to 1994. This controversial undertaking would transform public perception of the Sistine ceiling and ignite heated debates about conservation ethics and the nature of Michelangelo's original intentions. The restoration team, led by Chief Restorer Gianluigi Colalucci, employed state-of-the-art conservation techniques to address centuries of accumulated damage and alteration. Their approach began with extensive scientific analysis, including microscopic examination of the painted surface and chemical analysis of the materials present. This research informed every subsequent decision in the restoration process. The most visible aspect of the restoration was the removal of surface grime and previous conservation treatments. Using a solution of distilled water, sodium bicarbonate, and ammonium bicarbonate applied with cotton swabs, the team gradually dissolved the accumulated residue. As this material was removed, colors of unexpected brilliance emerged from beneath the darkened surface. The revelation of these vibrant colors surprised many observers accustomed to the muted, somber tones previously visible. Art historians had long described Michelangelo as a master of form who was less interested in color. The restoration suggested a different reality. Michelangelo had employed a bold, vibrant palette that had been obscured for centuries under layers of dirt and darkened glue. This dramatic transformation sparked immediate controversy. Some critics accused the restoration team of removing not just dirt, but also original materials applied by Michelangelo himself. They argued that the artist had applied additional secco details, painted on dry plaster after the fresco had set, that were being stripped away in the cleaning process. Others suggested that the bright colors, now visible, were garish and inconsistent with Renaissance aesthetics. Defenders of the restoration countered with scientific evidence supporting their approach. Microscopic analysis showed clear differentiation between Michelangelo's original fresco painting and later accretions. They pointed to contemporary accounts describing the ceiling's bright colors when newly completed. The technical evidence suggested that what was being removed was indeed foreign material, not original artistry. The restoration controversy reflected deeper questions about authenticity and the nature of historical artifacts. What constitutes the true Sistine ceiling? Is it the object as it existed at the moment of completion? The object as it had evolved over centuries of aging and intervention? Or something in between? These philosophical questions have no definitive answers, but continue to inform approaches to conservation worldwide. Beyond the aesthetic debate, the restoration addressed structural issues threatening the ceiling's long-term survival. Areas of detached plaster were stabilized with injections of compatible materials. Cracks were carefully filled. These interventions, less visible but equally important, helped ensure the physical integrity of the ceiling for future generations. The restored ceiling revealed technical aspects of Michelangelo's process previously obscured. The divisions between ornate became more visible, allowing conservators to reconstruct his working sequence with greater precision. Evidence of his drawing process, including incised lines made in the wet plaster to guide his painting, could now be studied in detail. The restoration thus contributed significantly to scholarly understanding of Michelangelo's working methods. Perhaps most surprisingly, the clean ceiling revealed a more sculptural approach to painting than previously recognized. With the obscuring layers removed, the modulation of light and shadow in the figures became more pronounced. Michelangelo's use of color to enhance the three-dimensional quality of his forms became evident. The restoration thus reinforced understanding of how his primary identity as a sculptor influenced his approach to painting. Since the completion of the major restoration in 1994, conservation efforts have shifted toward preventive measures designed to minimize future deterioration. Environmental monitoring systems track temperature, humidity, and air quality within the chapel. Specialized filtration systems remove particulates and pollutants from the air. These technologies aim to create optimal conditions for the ceiling's continued preservation. Despite these advances, significant challenges remain. Chief among these is the impact of mass tourism on the chapel environment. Before the COVID-19 pandemic temporarily halted visitation, the Sistine Chapel regularly received up to 30,000 visitors per day, approximately 6 million annually. This human presence introduces substantial changes to the chapel's microclimate. Each visitor brings moisture and heat into the environment through respiration and body temperature. The collective impact of thousands of visitors daily creates humidity fluctuations that can stress the fresco surface. Carbon dioxide from human breath can form carbonic acid in the presence of moisture, potentially interacting with the calcium carbonate in the plaster. These subtle chemical processes represent a slow but persistent threat to the ceiling's integrity. Physical vibrations from foot traffic represent another concern. While visitors do not directly touch the ceiling, the cumulative impact of millions of footsteps annually creates low-level vibrations that travel through the building structure. Over time, these vibrations could potentially weaken the bond between plaster layers or between the plaster and its supporting surface. Vatican authorities have implemented various measures to mitigate these threats. Visitor numbers are controlled, though demand continues to exceed ideal capacity from a conservation perspective. Advanced climate control systems work to maintain stable conditions despite fluctuating occupancy. Continuous monitoring allows conservators to detect any emerging issues before they become serious problems. The resilience of Michelangelo's masterpiece in the face of these challenges testifies to the fundamental soundness of its creation. The technical decisions made 5 centuries ago continue to protect the work today. This durability was not accidental, but resulted from Michelangelo's mastery of his materials and methods, even in a medium he initially resisted. As we consider the ceiling's remarkable survival through 5 centuries of human history, we gain a deeper appreciation for Michelangelo's achievement. Beyond its artistic brilliance and theological profundity, the Sistine Chapel ceiling represents a triumph of technical execution. Its endurance through time reflects not just careful stewardship, but inherent qualities built into the work from its creation. The story of the ceiling's preservation reminds us that great art exists in physical form, subject to the same natural processes that affect all material objects. Its continued existence requires both the initial genius of its creator and the ongoing commitment of those charged with its care. The Sistine Chapel ceiling has benefited from both, allowing it to remain a living connection to Renaissance achievement and to Michelangelo's extraordinary vision. When visitors to the Vatican museums enter the Sistine Chapel today, they encounter colors of astonishing vibrancy. Blues as deep as the Mediterranean sky, reds that pulse with life, flesh tones that capture the warmth and vitality of the human form. These brilliant hues bring Michelangelo's divine figures into our world with an immediacy that can take the breath away. Yet for centuries, This was not the Sistine Chapel that visitors experienced. For nearly 500 years after its completion, the ceiling that greeted pilgrims and tourists was a dramatically different visual experience. The figures appeared to emerge from shadows, their forms discernible, but their colors muted behind a veil of darkness. Art historians wrote extensively about Michelangelo's mastery of form and his relative disinterest in color. His reputation developed as an artist concerned primarily with line and volume, not chromatic expression. This understanding of Michelangelo's artistic priorities shaped critical responses to his work for generations. Scholarly assessments emphasized his sculptural approach to painting, his focus on the human form, his dramatic compositions. Color was considered secondary in his artistic thinking, a mere adjunct to the powerful forms that were his true concern. This perspective seemed consistent with the somber, shadowy ceiling visible to all who visited the chapel. But this perception began to change dramatically in the 1980s, when the Vatican embarked on an ambitious restoration project that would transform both the physical appearance of the Sistine ceiling and our understanding of Michelangelo as an artist. The project, spanning from 1980 to 1999, represented one of the most significant art restoration undertakings in history, both for the importance of the work being treated and for the controversies it would generate. The decision to restore the Sistine Chapel's artwork came after years of careful consideration. Conservation experts had grown increasingly concerned about the condition of the frescoes. While structurally sound for the most part, the painted surfaces were obscured by centuries of accumulated material. Candle smoke from countless religious ceremonies had deposited soot on the walls and ceiling. Dust and airborne pollutants had accumulated in layers. Previous restoration attempts had applied various substances that had darkened over time. The technical challenges were formidable. The ceiling stands approximately 20 meters above the chapel floor, requiring specialized scaffolding for access. The scale of the painted surface, approximately 5,000 square feet, meant that the work would necessarily extend over many years. Most challenging of all was determining the appropriate conservation approach for a work of such cultural and religious significance. After extensive consultation with international experts, the Vatican Museums developed a restoration methodology based on the most current conservation science. The team would be led by Gianluigi Colalucci, chief restorer of the Vatican Museums, working with a small group of specialized conservators. Their approach would prioritize minimal intervention, using the gentlest effective methods to remove accumulated foreign material, while preserving all original paint applied by Michelangelo. Before any cleaning began, the team conducted extensive scientific analysis of the ceiling's condition. Microscopic examination revealed multiple layers of foreign material on the painted surface. Chemical analysis identified the composition of these materials: soot from candles and oil lamps, dust bound with fatty deposits, animal glues applied in previous restorations, and various fixatives intended to protect the paintings. The analysis also revealed something surprising. Beneath these accumulated layers, Michelangelo's original colors remained remarkably well preserved. The chemical bond between pigment and plaster had maintained its integrity. If the overlying materials could be safely removed, the ceiling might reveal colors not seen since the 16th century. The restoration team developed a cleaning solution specifically for this project, a mixture of distilled water, sodium bicarbonate, baking soda, and ammonium bicarbonate. This mild, non-toxic formulation would dissolve the accumulated grime without damaging the original fresco surface. The solution was applied with cotton swabs in a gentle, methodical process that allowed for precise control and continual monitoring. As cleaning progressed, panel by panel, an astonishing transformation became evident. Colors of unexpected brilliance emerged from beneath the darkened surface. Skies that had appeared nearly black revealed themselves as vivid blue. Draperies that had seemed muted gray or brown showed rich reds, greens, and purples. Flesh tones took on a warm luminosity that brought the figures to life in a way not seen for centuries. The most dramatic revelation involved Michelangelo's use of color. Far from being secondary to his artistic concerns, color proved integral to his vision for the ceiling. He had employed a bold, vibrant palette that enhanced the sculptural quality of his figures while creating visual harmonies across the vast composition. The restoration revealed Michelangelo as a master colorist whose chromatic sensibility had been literally obscured for centuries. This transformation did not occur without controversy. As images of the cleaned sections began to circulate, some art historians and critics expressed alarm at what they saw. The bright colors seemed inconsistent with the somber Michelangelo they knew from scholarship and reproduction. Some feared that original materials were being removed along with the accumulated grime. Others questioned whether such dramatic intervention was appropriate for a work of this significance. The controversy intensified in 1987 when a group of prominent artists and art historians, including Columbia University Professor James Beck, publicly criticized the restoration. They argued that the cleaning was too aggressive, potentially removing final touches that Michelangelo had applied a secco on dry plaster after the fresco had set. These critics suggested that the ceiling was being fundamentally altered rather than merely cleaned. The restoration team defended their approach with technical evidence. Microscopic examination clearly differentiated between Michelangelo's original fresco painting and later accretions. Chemical analysis confirmed that what was being removed consisted of foreign materials introduced after the ceiling's completion. Careful documentation before, during, and after cleaning provided a transparent record of all interventions. Historical evidence also supported the restoration approach. Contemporary accounts from the 16th century described the ceiling's bright colors when newly completed. Giorgio Vasari, the early biographer of Renaissance artists, wrote of how Michelangelo had painted the ceiling with the finest of colors. These historical descriptions aligned much more closely with the restored ceiling than with its darkened pre-restoration state. The controversy reflected deeper questions about authenticity and historical artifacts. Should works of art be experienced as they were originally created, or as they have evolved through centuries of aging and human intervention? Is the patina of age, the accumulated evidence of an object's journey through time, part of its authentic nature? These philosophical questions extend beyond the Sistine Chapel to all historical conservation efforts. As the restoration progressed from the ceiling to the altar wall, where Michelangelo's Last Judgment fresco presented its own conservation challenges, another significant aspect of the project emerged. The cleaning revealed that many of the nude figures in the Last Judgment had been altered after Michelangelo's death, with painted draperies added to cover their genitalia. These modifications originated in the Counter-Reformation period, when the Catholic Church responded to Protestant criticism by emphasizing decorum in religious art. In 1564, shortly after Michelangelo's death, Pope Pius IV ordered the addition of painted loincloths and draperies to cover the nude figures in the Last Judgment. This task was assigned to Daniele da Volterra, who consequently earned the nickname Il Braghetone, the breeches maker. The restoration team faced a significant decision regarding these post-Michelangelo additions. Should they be removed as non-original elements, or preserved as part of the work's historical evolution? After careful consideration, the decision was made to remove most of the added draperies, restoring the figures to Michelangelo's original conception. This approach prioritized the artist's vision over subsequent modifications, even those with their own historical significance. Not all of the added draperies were removed, however. In cases where removing the overpaint would have damaged Michelangelo's original work underneath, the later editions were preserved. This selective approach balanced respect for Michelangelo's intentions with practical conservation concerns. It also preserved some evidence of the work's complex reception history, acknowledging that even alterations tell an important cultural story. As sections of the restoration were completed and revealed to the public, initial skepticism began to give way to appreciation for many observers. The vibrant colors and clear details allowed for new scholarly insights into Michelangelo's technique and iconography. Features previously obscured by grime became legible, enriching interpretation of the complex theological program of the ceiling. The clean ceiling revealed Michelangelo's sophisticated use of color to enhance spatial effects. He employed cooler tones for distant elements and warmer ones for foreground figures, creating a sense of atmospheric perspective. His careful modulation of tone within individual figures enhanced their three-dimensional presence. These subtle coloristic strategies had been largely invisible beneath the accumulated surface material. Technical aspects of Michelangelo's process also became more evident. The divisions between Giornate, day's work sections, appeared more clearly, allowing scholars to reconstruct his working sequence with greater precision. Evidence of his preparatory methods, including incised lines made in the wet plaster, became more visible. The restoration thus contributed significantly to the technical understanding of how the ceiling was created. The project also incorporated important preventive conservation measures. A new climate control system was installed in the chapel to maintain stable temperature and humidity levels. Air filtration technology was implemented to reduce airborne pollutants. These environmental improvements aim to slow the inevitable processes of deterioration and minimize the need for future interventions. By 1994, the ceiling restoration was complete, with work continuing on the wall frescoes until 1999. The total cost of the project reached approximately $420 million. Funded primarily by Japanese television network Nippon Television, which received exclusive rights to photograph the restoration process in exchange for financial support. This corporate sponsorship model represented a new approach to funding major conservation projects. When the scaffolding finally came down and visitors could experience the fully restored ceiling, the visual impact was stunning. The figures seemed to advance from the surface with newfound presence and vitality. The narrative scenes acquired greater legibility and emotional power. The overall effect was one of revelation, as if a window had been opened to allow clear light to illuminate what had been in shadow. For art historians, the restoration necessitated a reassessment of Michelangelo's artistic priorities. His masterful use of color could no longer be considered secondary to his interest in form. Instead, the restoration revealed an integrated artistic vision in which color and form worked together to create figures of unprecedented power and presence. This revised understanding has influenced subsequent scholarship on Michelangelo and Renaissance art more broadly. For the millions of visitors who experience the Sistine Chapel each year, the restoration has transformed their encounter with Michelangelo's achievement. The vibrant ceiling visible today offers a more direct connection to the artist's original vision than was possible for generations of previous visitors. The brilliant colors, dynamic compositions, and expressive figures create an immersive experience that captures the revolutionary impact the ceiling must have had when newly completed. The Sistine Chapel restoration remains a landmark in conservation history, not just for its technical achievements, but for how it changed our relationship with a canonical work of art. By removing the veil of time that had accumulated between Michelangelo's hand and our eyes, the restoration allowed for a more immediate encounter with his artistic vision. What emerged was not simply a cleaned version of a familiar masterpiece, but a work that seemed newly created, vital and present in ways that had been lost for centuries. The controversies surrounding the restoration have themselves become an important chapter in the ceiling's history. The passionate debates about authenticity, historical continuity, and interpretive framing reflected the central place the Sistine Chapel occupies in our cultural imagination. That such technical decisions could generate international controversy speaks to the profound significance attached to this singular artistic achievement. Among the hundreds of figures that populate Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling, one particular image has transcended the realm of religious art to become a universal cultural icon. The scene depicting the moment of creation, where God and Adam reach toward each other with outstretched arms and nearly touching fingers, has been reproduced on everything from coffee mugs to smartphone cases. This fragment of the vast ceiling composition has achieved a visual fame rivaled by few other images in art history. Known formally as the creation of Adam, this panel occupies a central position in the ceiling's narrative sequence. It illustrates the biblical passage from Genesis where God breathes life into the first human being. In Michelangelo's interpretation, the divine animation of Adam occurs through a gesture rather than direct physical contact. The small gap between their fingertips creates a visual tension that seems to crackle with the potential energy of imminent creation. The power of this image derives partly from its compositional brilliance. The two figures mirror each other in posture, yet contrast in their expression and energy. Adam reclines languidly on the earth, his muscular body suggesting potential strength, not yet fully awakened. His arm extends toward God with a certain lassitude, as if he has not yet received the divine spark that will fully animate him. The first man exists physically, but awaits the spiritual and intellectual enlightenment that will make him truly human. God, by contrast, rushes into the scene with dynamic energy, propelled by billowing drapery and surrounded by angels. His powerful arm reaches decisively toward Adam, fingertip extended in a gesture of intentional transmission. Unlike Adam's passive extension, God's movement communicates purpose and power. The Creator appears eager to bestow the gift of consciousness on his creation, actively bringing the encounter to its culmination. For centuries, viewers have found meaning in this extraordinary composition on multiple levels. In religious terms, it visualizes the moment of divine animation, when humanity receives the breath of life from its Creator. In philosophical terms, it captures the instant of awakening consciousness, the spark that distinguishes human existence. In visual terms, it achieves perfect balance between tension and resolution, creating an eternal moment, perpetually on the verge of completion. But in recent decades, scientific observers have proposed an additional surprising interpretation of this famous scene. In 1990, Franklin Meshberger, an American physician specializing in obstetrics and gynecology, published an article in the Journal of the American Medical Association that proposed a radical new reading of the composition. According to Meshberger, the flowing drapery and angelic figures surrounding God in the painting precisely outline the anatomy of the human brain. This hypothesis suggests that the Creator figure is positioned within a shroud that anatomically resembles a sagittal cross-section of the human brain. The angels and draperies around God form shapes that correspond to the cerebrum, the brain stem, the pituitary gland, the frontal lobe, and other neuroanatomical structures. According to this interpretation, Michelangelo wasn't merely depicting God giving life to Adam, but specifically granting him the divine gift of intellect, consciousness, and cognition. The implications of this reading are profound. If intentional, it would mean that Michelangelo embedded a sophisticated anatomical reference within one of the most theologically significant scenes in Western art. It would suggest that he viewed the divine spark that separates humans from other creation as specifically intellectual in nature. Most remarkably, it would demonstrate his advanced understanding of neuroanatomy at a time when scientific knowledge of the brain structure was still developing. Mechberger's theory gains credibility when we consider Michelangelo's known interest in human anatomy. From his early 20s, the artist had performed dissections of human cadavers, initially to improve his understanding of musculature for sculptural purposes. These dissections, conducted primarily at the Hospital of Santo Spirito in Florence, gave him first-hand knowledge of human internal anatomy that few artists of his time possessed. Contemporary accounts confirm Michelangelo's anatomical studies. His early biographer, Ascanio Condivi, wrote that the artist devoted much time to the study of anatomy, and that he had intended to write a treatise on the subject for artists. Giorgio Vasari similarly noted that Michelangelo had dissected so many human bodies that he ruined his health. These historical sources establish that Michelangelo possessed both the opportunity and the inclination to study brain anatomy directly. The historical context lends further plausibility to this interpretation. The Renaissance period witnessed a revival of interest in human anatomy among artists and scientists alike. Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo's older contemporary, produced detailed anatomical drawings, including studies of the brain and cranial nerves. In this intellectual environment, Michelangelo's incorporation of anatomical knowledge into his art would not have been without precedent. The relationship between art and science was much more fluid during the Renaissance than in later periods. Leading figures moved between what we now consider separate disciplines, seeing them as complementary approaches to understanding the world. In this context, Michelangelo's potential integration of neuroanatomical knowledge into a religious painting reflects the Renaissance ideal of universal knowledge, where scientific observation and spiritual insight were not seen as contradictory, but as different facets of understanding divine creation. Since Mechberger's original publication, other medical professionals have expanded on his observations. In 2010, medical illustrator Ian Esukai and neurosurgeon Rafael Tamargo published an analysis suggesting that another section of the Sistine ceiling, the separation of light from darkness, also contains neuroanatomical references. They identified what appears to be an accurate depiction of the human brainstem and spinal cord embedded in God's neck and chest in this panel. These interpretations remain controversial among art historians. Some embrace the brain hypothesis as evidence of Michelangelo's anatomical knowledge and symbolic sophistication. Others remain skeptical, suggesting that the perceived resemblance may be coincidental, or that modern viewers are projecting their own scientific knowledge onto a Renaissance religious painting. The debate illustrates the complex intersection of art history, medical knowledge, and interpretive theory. Those who support the brain interpretation point to specific anatomical details that seem too precise to be accidental. The figure in the crook of God's left arm appears to represent the pituitary gland in its correct anatomical position. The leg of an angel seems positioned to represent the spinal cord. A fold in the billowing cloak outlines the shape of the vertebral artery. These correspondences, they argue, go beyond what coincidence might reasonably explain. Skeptics counter that Renaissance drapery styles naturally create flowing, organic forms that might resemble biological structures without deliberate intent. They note that no contemporary documentation mentions Michelangelo incorporating brain anatomy into the composition, though his anatomical studies are well attested. Some suggest that seeing the brain in the painting represents a kind of pareidolia, the psychological tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in ambiguous visual information. What makes the brain hypothesis particularly compelling is how it aligns with Renaissance Neoplatonic philosophy, which influenced Michelangelo's intellectual circle. This philosophical tradition emphasized the divine nature of human intellect and its central role in connecting humanity to God. If Michelangelo intended to depict God bestowing not just life, but specifically intellectual capacity, embedding the brain in the composition would create a powerful visual metaphor consistent with contemporary philosophical thought. The potential theological implications are equally significant. By suggesting that God's gift to Adam was specifically the human intellect, Michelangelo would be making a statement about what fundamentally distinguishes humanity from other creation. This interpretation sees the divine spark not merely as biological life, but as consciousness, reason, and the capacity for moral understanding. It positions intellectual capacity as the defining characteristic of humanity's creation in God's image. Whether intentional or coincidental, the brain-like formation in the creation of Adam has become part of how modern viewers experience the image. Once seen, the resemblance becomes difficult to unsee, influencing subsequent viewings of the painting. This demonstrates how interpretations of art evolve over time, incorporating new perspectives based on advancing knowledge. Michelangelo's masterpiece continues to generate new meanings, centuries after its creation. The enduring fascination with this hypothesis speaks to the complexity and richness of Michelangelo's achievement. The Sistine Chapel ceiling operates simultaneously on multiple levels, as biblical narrative, theological statement, artistic tour de force, and potentially as scientific observation. This layered meaning creates a work that continues to reward scrutiny and remains inexhaustible despite centuries of study. Beyond the brain hypothesis, the creation of Adam contains other symbolic elements that enrich its meaning. The 12 figures surrounding God have been interpreted as representing the celestial spheres of traditional cosmology. The green scarf flowing in the composition has been seen as symbolizing the life force. The relative positions of the two main figures create a diagonal that draws the eye across the picture plane, symbolizing the movement from material to spiritual existence. The position of this scene within the larger ceiling program is also significant. Michelangelo arranged the central panels to depict key moments from Genesis, in reverse chronological order, moving from the altar toward the entrance. The creation of Adam appears at a pivotal point in this sequence, marking the moment when the material world receives its spiritual culmination in human consciousness. This positioning emphasizes the scene's importance in the theological narrative. The artistic influence of this single panel extends far beyond religious art. The nearly touching fingers have become a visual shorthand for connection, potential, and the spark of creation. This motif has been appropriated and parodied in countless contexts, from advertisements to movie posters to digital media. Few other artistic images have achieved such universal recognition or been repurposed in so many different cultural contexts. Perhaps the most famous modern reinterpretation appears in Steven Spielberg's film E.T., The Extraterrestrial, where the alien and human protagonist reach toward each other with extended fingers in a direct visual quotation of Michelangelo's composition. This science fiction context transforms the original religious meaning while preserving the essential idea of momentous connection between different forms of consciousness. Such adaptability speaks to the fundamental power of Michelangelo's visual metaphor. In 1929, the image gained yet another layer of cultural significance when it was adapted for the logo of an Italian government initiative to restore the Sistine Chapel. In this design, the two reaching hands represented the partnership between public institutions and private sponsors in preserving cultural heritage. This usage brought the image full circle, employing it to promote the preservation of the very artwork from which it came. The near universal recognition of this image raises interesting questions about cultural memory and visual literacy. Many people who have never visited the Sistine Chapel or studied Renaissance art can instantly recognize the creation of Adam. Yet, this recognition often exists separate from understanding of its original context or meaning. The image has, in a sense, transcended its origins to become an independent cultural signifier. This phenomenon reflects the extraordinary visual power Michelangelo achieved in this composition. By distilling a complex theological concept into a single, perfectly balanced gesture, he created an image that communicates across cultural and temporal boundaries. The nearly touching fingers embody the concept of potential energy and imminent connection so effectively that viewers intuitively grasp its significance, regardless of their familiarity with the biblical narrative. Whether Michelangelo intentionally incorporated brain anatomy into this composition remains an open question that continues to stimulate scholarly and public imagination. The absence of definitive documentary evidence means the hypothesis cannot be conclusively proven or disproven. This very uncertainty contributes to the painting's enduring fascination, allowing it to accumulate new layers of interpretation while maintaining its essential mystery. What remains beyond doubt is Michelangelo's achievement in creating an image of such perfect visual tension and symbolic resonance that it continues to speak to viewers 5 centuries after its creation. In those few inches of space between divine and human fingertips, he captured something essential about the human condition. That gap, never closed but forever about to close, represents the tantalizing proximity of human consciousness to divine understanding, eternally reaching but never quite touching. Beyond its artistic magnificence and cultural significance, the Sistine Chapel serves a function of profound religious and historical importance that many visitors may not fully appreciate. While millions marvel at Michelangelo's ceiling each year, this seemingly modest rectangular brick building periodically transforms into the stage for one of the world's most consequential elections. For when the time comes to select a new pope, the Catholic Church's highest office, it is within these painted walls that the decision takes place. The Sistine Chapel's role as the venue for papal conclaves connects Michelangelo's masterpiece to a living tradition of religious governance that continues to this day. This function was not an afterthought, but integral to the chapel's identity long before Michelangelo lifted his brush to its ceiling. Indeed, the very name of the chapel reveals its papal connections, as it honors the pontiff who commissioned its construction in the 1470s, Pope Sixtus IV. Sixtus IV, born Francesco della Rovere, was a significant Renaissance patron whose papacy lasted from 1471 to 1484. While his reputation includes both accomplishments and controversies, his architectural legacy remains undisputed. He undertook an ambitious program to restore and embellish Rome, including the construction of the chapel that bears his name. The Sistine Chapel replaced an earlier medieval structure known as the Cappella Maggiore, which had fallen into disrepair. The new chapel, designed by architect Baccio Pontelli, was completed around 1481. Its dimensions were not chosen arbitrarily, but specifically matched those described in the biblical account of Solomon's Temple. Approximately 40 meters long, 13 meters wide, and 20 meters high. This deliberate parallel with the biblical temple emphasized the chapel's sacred significance and its connection to ancient religious traditions. From the beginning, the Sistine Chapel served dual functions: as a site for important papal ceremonies and as the setting for papal conclaves. The first such conclave, held in the newly constructed chapel, took place in 1492, following the death of Pope Innocent VIII. This election resulted in the selection of Rodrigo Borgia, who took the name Alexander VI and became one of history's most controversial popes. The chapel has hosted nearly every papal election since that time, The conclave process developed over centuries as the Church sought to ensure that papal elections would be both spiritually sound and protected from outside interference. The word conclave itself derives from the Latin conclave, meaning with a key, referring to the practice of literally locking the cardinal electors inside the chapel until they reach a decision. This seclusion aims to focus the cardinals' attention on their sacred duty and shield them from external pressures. When a pope dies or resigns, the latter being exceedingly rare before Benedict XVI's resignation in 2013, a complex series of events is set in motion. After appropriate mourning periods and funeral rites, the College of Cardinals gathers in Rome. Cardinals under the age of 80 form the voting body, currently numbering around 120 when at full complement. These men, appointed from around the world, bear the responsibility of selecting the next leader of the global Catholic Church. The physical transformation of the Sistine Chapel for a conclave is substantial. The magnificent space that tourists experience disappears beneath practical modifications. Wooden platforms create a level floor over the chapel's marble pavement. 2 rows of tables are arranged along the long walls, providing each cardinal with an assigned seat. A small stove is installed in one corner, connected to the chapel's roof by a temporary chimney. This humble appliance will eventually broadcast the conclave's outcome to the waiting world. The elaborate frescoes that normally command visitors' attention, Michelangelo's Ceiling and Last Judgment, along with wall paintings by Botticelli, Perugino, and others, now form a silent audience to the proceedings. One might wonder what impact these sacred images have on the cardinals as they deliberate. Does Michelangelo's vision of creation and judgment influence their considerations? Do the depicted apostles and prophets serve as spiritual witnesses to their deliberations? Security measures for modern conclaves are extensive. Electronic sweeps ensure no recording or communication devices remain in the chapel. The Sistine Chapel and adjacent Vatican buildings used by the cardinals during the conclave are isolated from outside contact. Windows are sealed, and special electronic jamming equipment prevents any unauthorized communications. These precautions maintain the integrity of the conclave's seclusion in an age of advanced technology. Once the conclave begins, the daily routine centers around voting sessions in the chapel. Each cardinal receives a rectangular paper ballot with the printed Latin words, "Elego in summum pontificem," I elect as supreme pontiff. Below this phrase, each elector writes his chosen candidate's name, disguising his handwriting to maintain anonymity. The cardinals then approach the altar one by one, placing their folded ballots in a chalice, while swearing that they have voted according to their conscience. 3 selected cardinals serve as scrutineers, reading each ballot aloud and recording the votes. Another 3 cardinals verify the count. The process is methodical and solemn, conducted in an atmosphere of prayer and contemplation. When all votes have been counted, the ballots are threaded with a needle and string, then burned in the small stove, along with chemical additives that produce the famous colored smoke. This smoke signal system dates back centuries, but was formalized in its current form in the early 20th century. If no candidate has received the required 2/3 majority, the smoke appears black, signaling to the waiting crowd in St. Peter's Square that the church remains without a pope. If a candidate has secured the necessary votes, white smoke billows from the chimney, triggering bells and cheers as the world learns that a new pontiff has been chosen. The contrast between this ancient smoke signal and our modern information age creates a powerful juxtaposition. In a world of instant digital communication, the Catholic Church continues to announce one of its most significant decisions through this elemental signal of colored smoke. The system occasionally produces ambiguous results, smoke that appears gray rather than definitively black or white, creating moments of confusion for waiting crowds and media. Despite such occasional uncertainties, the tradition persists. The voting continues with up to 4 ballots per day until a pope is elected. Modern conclaves typically last only a few days, though historically some continued for months or even years. If the cardinals struggle to reach consensus, they may pause for a day of prayer and reflection after approximately 2 weeks of voting. This break allows for informal discussions and spiritual renewal before resuming the electoral process. When a cardinal finally receives the required 2/3 majority, the dean of the College of Cardinals asks him, "Do you accept your canonical election as Supreme Pontiff?" This moment represents a profound personal decision. The chosen cardinal must immediately accept or decline the position that will transform his life and identity. If he accepts, he is asked by what name he wishes to be known, establishing the papal name by which history will remember him. The newly elected pope then withdraws to the Room of Tears, a small chamber adjacent to the Sistine chapel. There, he changes from his cardinal's robes into the white vestments of the papacy. The room's evocative name acknowledges the overwhelming emotional weight of the moment, as the individual confronts the enormous responsibilities he has just accepted. Many newly elected popes have indeed been moved to tears in this private moment of transition. Meanwhile, the senior cardinal deacon appears on the central balcony of St. Peter's Basilica and pronounces the famous Latin phrase to the waiting crowd. "Habemus Papam, we have a pope." He announces the new pontiff's name and his chosen papal name. Moments later, the newly vested pope appears on the balcony to deliver his first blessing, Urbi et Orbi, to the city and the world. This moment of public revelation completes the transition from conclave secrecy to the new pope's public ministry. The use of the Sistine chapel for this momentous process creates a profound connection between Michelangelo's artistic achievement and the ongoing life of the Catholic Church. The chapel is not merely a museum piece preserving Renaissance genius, but remains a functioning sacred space central to the Church's governance. The cardinals make their momentous decision literally, under the painted scenes of humanity's creation and judgment, surrounded by biblical narratives of divine guidance and human response. This continuing religious function enriches our understanding of the Sistine Chapel beyond its artistic significance. When Michelangelo painted the ceiling between 1508 and 1512, he worked in a space already consecrated by prayer and pivotal decisions. The chapel had already hosted several conclaves before his brushes touched its ceiling. His work thus entered a living tradition, rather than creating a mere decorative environment. The chapel's dual identity as artistic masterpiece and religious venue creates certain tensions in its modern usage. The millions of tourists who visit annually potentially conflict with its sacred function. When a papal election approaches, the public viewing schedule is suspended as Vatican staff prepare the chapel for conclave. The temporary installations required for the cardinal's use must be designed to avoid damaging the historic artwork, requiring careful engineering and installation. Climate control presents another significant challenge. The presence of thousands of daily visitors introduces moisture, heat, and carbon dioxide that potentially threaten the fresco's preservation. Yet, during a conclave, the chapel must accommodate the cardinals in reasonable comfort for extended periods. These competing requirements necessitate sophisticated environmental systems that can adapt to the chapel's changing functions while protecting its irreplaceable art. The most recent conclaves have attracted unprecedented global media attention. When white smoke appeared in March 2013, announcing the election of Pope Francis, television networks worldwide interrupted regular programming to broadcast the moment live. Social media platforms erupted with the news, demonstrating how this ancient process continues to captivate global attention in the digital age. Few other elected positions in the world generate such widespread interest. This media focus has increased pressure for transparency in the conclave process, traditionally shrouded in secrecy. While cardinals take an oath of absolute confidentiality regarding the proceedings, details occasionally emerge through anonymous sources. The Church has responded by strengthening secrecy measures, while also providing more official information about the process itself, striking a balance between traditional discretion and modern expectations of openness. The Sistine Chapel's role in papal elections connects Michelangelo's Renaissance masterpiece to contemporary global events in a unique way. Few other artistic works from the 16th century remain so directly relevant to current world affairs. When cardinals cast their votes beneath the painted ceiling, the temporal distance between Michelangelo's time and our own seems momentarily compressed. His art becomes not just historical heritage, but a living context for decisions that will shape the future. This continuity of purpose offers a different perspective on the ceiling's significance. Beyond its artistic innovation and theological content, Michelangelo's work participates in an ongoing tradition of faith and governance. The scenes he painted, from creation to the flood, surrounded by prophets who foretold Christ's coming, form a visual theological framework for the momentous decisions made beneath them. The ceiling thus continues to fulfill its original purpose, not merely to beautify a space, but to inspire and instruct those who gather within it. As we conclude our exploration of Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, we've traveled from his initial reluctance to accept the commission through the physical challenges of its creation, its remarkable preservation across centuries, its controversial restoration, and finally, its continuing function in papal elect. Throughout this journey, we've encountered a work that transcends categories. Simultaneously, an artistic masterpiece, a theological statement, a technical achievement, and a living religious space. The story of the Sistine Chapel reminds us that great art exists not in isolation, but embedded in human history and institutions. Michelangelo's ceiling emerged from specific historical circumstances: a demanding pope, a reluctant artist, the theological concerns of the pre-Reformation Church, the technical possibilities and limitations of fresco painting. Yet it has transcended those origins to speak across centuries, continuing to astonish and move viewers with its power and beauty. Perhaps this is the ultimate testament to Michelangelo's achievement, that a work created for a specific religious purpose in early 16th century Rome continues to resonate with millions of diverse visitors 5 centuries later. Whether viewed as religious inspiration, artistic innovation, or technical tour de force, the Sistine Chapel ceiling remains one of humanity's most extraordinary creations, and one that continues to serve its original purpose while accumulating new meanings for each generation that encounters. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of art history's greatest achievements. If you've enjoyed this exploration, please consider subscribing to Insomnia History for more deep dives into fascinating historical topics. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video. Until next time, this is Insomnia History, keeping the past alive while you're awake at night.